Stand-Up Historian. Those who tell stories rule society.
Hello and welcome to a Stand-Up Historian. My name is Kurosh and I bring this podcast to you from beautiful Seattle, Washington. In this episode of a Stand-Up Historian, I want to tell you the story of how the CIA conducted secret LSD experiments on U.S. citizens without their consent or even knowledge. I want to, as usual, invite you to visit my website at standuphistorian.com. Submit your questions, your comments, and if you require a reply from me, I will make sure to reply back to you. And thank you for listening. After the World War II, the possibility or just the thought of gaining control over a person's mind became one of the top pursuits of intelligence services in most Western countries and also in the Eastern Bloc. In the midst of never-ending spy games and during the Cold War, the capacity to make someone tell the truth, the full truth, during an interrogation, or to wipe out a subject's memories, personalities, and even worse, impose another personality or memory, perhaps a controlled one, became very attractive to secret services. This was not new, and after the World War II, both Allies and Soviet Union, they learned a lot about advances that Germans and Nazis had made in this direction and creating a so-called truth serum. So, in 1979, former U.S. State Department officer John Marks published a book called The Search for Manchurian Candidate. And in his book, he focused on CIA's mind control experiments, and his book is based on documents that was released under the Freedom of Information Act. But before I go any further, I have to explain the term Manchurian Candidate. The term emerged from a title of a novel by Richard Condon, which was first published in 1959. In 1962, a movie starring Frank Sinatra was made based on this book, and again in 2004, another movie, The Manchurian Candidate, the second Manchurian Candidate movie starring Denzel Washington, was also made. The book tells the story of a U.S. soldier brainwashed and turned into an assassin by the communists. Back then, the fear that America's rivals could use such techniques was not only a fictional fantasy, but a matter of very serious concern. This is how John Marks describes it. In 1974, the National Security Act created not only the CIA, but also the National Security Council. In sum, the command structure for the Cold War. Wartime leaders like William Donovan and Allen Dulles lobbied feverishly for the act. Officials within the new command structure soon put their fears and their grandiose notion to work. Reaching to the perceived threat, they adopted a ruthless and warlike posture toward anyone they considered an enemy, most especially the Soviet Union. They took it upon themselves to fight communism and things that might lead to communism everywhere in the world. In 1975, the U.S. Senate Select Committee, chaired by Democratic Senator from Idaho, Frank Church, looked into the possible intelligence abuses committed in the past. It was part of a so-called Year of Intelligence, a series of investigations into the operations which included illegal, improper, or unethical activities. This is how the Church Committee presented this investigation. And in fact, there were reasons for the public to question the Secret Service's methods. After the Watergate scandal, it was disclosed that the CIA had a direct role in what happened. While describing the CIA's activities in his article for the New York Times, the famous investigative journalist Seymour Hersh, mentioned other agencies' operations targeting American citizens. The CIA itself only released the documents about this in 2007. So, Church Committee had quite a lot of work to do. The members held over 126 full committee meetings, 40 subcommittees hearings, and interviewed some 800 witnesses. After having searched through 110,000 documents, the committee published its final report in April 1976. It also issued a document called Alleged Assassination Plots Involving Foreign Leaders. And in this document, they detailed the intelligence's plans to kill several top figures like Patrice Lumumba and also Fidel Castro. The main report contains a huge chapter which is dedicated to the use of chemical and biological agents by the intelligence agencies. It says, fears that countries hostile to the United States would use chemical and biological agents against Americans or America's allies led to the development of defensive program designed to discover techniques for American intelligence agencies to detect and counterattack chemical and biological agents. And this is in the report, pointing that the defensive weapon soon turned into an offensive one. It always happens like that. It starts by excuses as using the techniques for defensive purposes, and soon it becomes offensive. The defensive orientation, in fact, soon became secondary, as the possible use of these agents to obtain information from or gain control over enemy agents became apparent. The report goes on to explain that the programs were so sensitive that, quote-unquote, few people even within the agencies knew about their existence. And it also says there is no evidence that either the executive branch or Congress were ever informed. As a result, scores of people suffered some damage, and at least, as far as we know, 2 of them died due to these experiments. One grim example is the case of American tennis player Harold Blower. In 1952, Harold voluntarily entered the New York Psychiatric Institute because he was suffering from depression caused by divorce and other issues that he had in his life. The Institute had a classified contract with the Army for research of potential chemical warfare agents. As part of an experiment that Harold didn't know nothing about, he was given a series of derivatives of a psychedelic substance called mescaline, and he died. He was diagnosed as pseudoneurotic schizophrenic and indirectly treated as one of the subjects of a program which later on in this episode I will talk about it, which is known as MKUltra. And unfortunately, just a month after he admitted himself to the hospital, he died. Following an extensive cover-up, the government revealed the truth to Blauer's family in 1975, that his death was caused by injections of mescaline derivatives. In 1987, a U.S. court ruled that government had covered up its role in the man's death. A judge ordered the authorities to pay $700,000 to Blauer's family. Since the late 1940s, the CIA ran several projects involving chemical and biological agents. And from 1947 to 1953, a project called Chatter researched quote-unquote truth drugs. We have to remember that when we're talking about 1947, we're talking about after World War II, and a lot of research, especially about chemicals, biological agents, are obtained by Americans after they investigated German scientists and they became familiar with their advancements and their research, which was years ahead of Americans and the whole of Western world at the time. According to the Church Commission's report, Project Chatter, was a response to quote-unquote reports of amazing results achieved by the Soviets. Animals and humans underwent tests involving a plant called Anabasis aphylla, and alkaloid scopolamine and mescaline. So the church report mentions that Project Chatter was a response to what Soviets had achieved, and we didn't want to fall behind in this kind of research. In 1950, a project dubbed BLUEBIRD was approved. Its aim was to investigate mind control methods that prevent personnel from quote-unquote unauthorized extraction of information, and that give the user the means to control an individual using special interrogation techniques. A year later, the project BLUEBIRD was rebranded, repackaged, and was presented as ARTICHOKE. Apart from its defensive purposes, it now included research into offensive interrogation techniques. Again, we see the move from defensive to offensive, involving hypnosis and drugs. There is no certain information about when the project ended. According to the Church Commission's report, the CIA insisted that Artichoke had been scrapped in 1956. However, there was evidence and witnesses and whistleblowers that the special interrogation it studied had been used for several more years. There was also MK Naomi, which was a project, and it investigated biological warfare agents, their storage, and devices for their diffusion. It also was scrapped after President Richard Nixon put an end to America's offensive biological weapons program in 1969. These are all official reports. And during the current war between Ukraine and Russia, we hear a lot about biolabs established, managed, and controlled by the United States in Ukraine. Now, let's get to the most famous part of mind control that CIA ever conducted, MKUltra. The CIA's main mind control research program, which turned out to be a real shock when it was discovered, was MKUltra, headed by Dr. Sidney Gottlieb. Born in Bronx in 1918, Gottlieb received a doctorate in biochemistry, and after working several research jobs for the government, he was recruited by the CIA in 1951 by Deputy Director Allen Dulles, who would later lead the agency. Dulles believed that there was undiscovered methods for controlling the human mind, and that these processes could help the US win wars. Dulles hired Gottlieb to lead the effort into mind control research by any means necessary. Launched in 1953 and discontinued a decade later, MKUltra involved testing human behavior, control with the likes of radiation, electroshock, psychological and psychiatric tools, harassment substances, and paramilitary devices. The project had a special branch called MK Delta to oversee tests conducted abroad. The reason most people know about MKUltra is because it involved LSD, a psychedelic drug created in 1938 by a Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann at the Sands Laboratories in Basel, Switzerland. On April 19, 1943, Hofmann accidentally took LSD himself and discovered how strong the effect might be. April 19 is now known as Bicycle Day, as Hofmann was riding a bike when he experienced the first ever so-called trip on LSD, commonly known as acid these days. Sandoz Laboratories began marketing the drug under the name Delicid. 4 years later, in 1948, it arrived to the US. The CIA knew about LSD's effects and relied on it so much that in 1953 there was a plan to purchase 10 kilograms of LSD, some 100 million doses, which at the time worth $240,000, just for experiments. The CIA then posed as a research foundation, made deals with universities, hospitals, and other institutions to get the materials and substances it needed. The tests were performed on human subjects, with or without their knowledge. Even those who volunteered to take part in the research were unaware of the real purpose behind it. Interestingly, the CIA considered that the secrecy aspect was needed as in a potential operation, the targeted subject would certainly be unwilling and unwitting to participate. Several tests involving LSD were conducted in the army. It was also used abroad during interrogations of alleged foreign spies. The hallucinogen was also tested on prisoners, sometimes on those with drug addictions, because they were the best candidates to test this. Several volunteer inmates from Lexington Rehabilitation Center, which is a prison for addicts serving sentences for drug violations, were given hallucinogenic drugs in exchange for drugs they were addicted to. So they replaced their usual drug with these hallucinogenic drugs. Among those prisoners was this very interesting character by the name of James Whitey Bulger. In his mid-20s, this future crime kingpin spent time in the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary for hijacking and armed robbery. While there, he volunteered to be part of a drug experiment that sought to find a cure for schizophrenia. That's actually what he was told. In reality, the experiment sought to determine how much LSD the human mind could take before it snapped. Bulger was fed large doses of the drug nearly every day for 15 months without being told what it was. In 2017, he described his experience, and according to Bulger, he realized that he had been taking part in the CIA experiments only years later, when he read The Search for the Manchurian Candidate. Whitey Bulger was recruited for the experiments together with several other inmates. According to his article, he was told it was a medical project aimed to find a cure for schizophrenia. For our participation, we would receive 3 days of good time for each month on the project, Bulger wrote. Each week, we would be locked in a secure room in the basement of the prison hospital, in an area where mental patients were housed. All the candidates were given massive doses of LSD and then tested for their reactions. This is how Whitey Bulger described it. 8 convicts in a panic and paranoid state. Total loss of appetite, hallucinating. The room would change shape. Hours of paranoia and feeling violent. We experienced horrible periods of living nightmares and even blood coming out of the walls. Guys turning to skeletons in front of me. I saw a camera change into the head of a dog. I felt like I was going insane. He said the experiments caused him long-lasting sleeping problems and nightmares. Bulger was later convicted of 11 murders. He may be an unsympathetic victim, but these same experiments were being conducted on unsuspecting civilians at the behest of one power-mad CIA official. Dr. Sidney Gottlieb sampled the drug LSD on himself, and this is what he says. Feeling as though I am in a kind of transparent sausage skin that covers my whole body. After that, he began testing it on military volunteers. Soon after, Gottlieb stopped caring whether people had volunteered, and began administering the drug to unwilling subjects, including CIA trainings. Gottlieb and many around him truly believed that LSD held the secret to controlling minds. He was also known as Poisoner in Chief. In November 1953, a group of CIA employees, including Sidney Gottlieb, together with scientists from the U.S. Biological Research Center called Camp Detrick, gathered in a cabin in Maryland for a conference. The group included Dr. Frank Olson. He was an expert in aerobiology. At some point, the CIA members decided to conduct an experiment on unwilling candidates. So Gottlieb's deputy, Robert Lashbrook, added LSD to a bottle of liquor, which was served after dinner. Olson, unfortunately, tasted it. When Olson returned home, family members noticed that he was depressed. 2 days later, Olson complained to his chief, Vincent Rouet, about his bad condition and what he experienced. Rouet contacted Lashbrook, and they took Olson to New York to meet a doctor close to the CIA who was experienced in LSD. In New York, Olson felt so bad that he even refused to fly back home and spend the Thanksgiving with his family. Later, Lashbrook claimed that during the last dinner they had together, the man looked almost the Dr. Olson before the experiment. According to Lashbrook's testimony, at 2:30 a.m., he was awakened by a loud crash of glass and saw that Olson had fallen to his death from the window of the room on the 10th floor. Olson's family, however, refused to believe it was a suicide, and they claimed that the aerobiology expert had been murdered. His family basically has three major points when they argue his death. Number one, the death of Frank Olson on November 28, 1953 was a murder, not a suicide. Number two, this is not an LSD drug experiment story, as it was represented in 1957. This is a biological warfare story. Frank Olson did not die because he was an experimental guinea pig who experienced a so-called bad trip. He died because of concern that he would divulge information concerning a highly classified CIA interrogation program called ARTICHOKE in the early 1950s, and concerning the use of biological weapons by the United States in the Korean War. And the third point that Olson family made is the truth concerning the death of Frank Olson was concealed from the Olson family as well as from the public in 1953. In 1975, a cover story regarding Frank Olson's death was disseminated. At the same time, a renewed cover-up of the truth concerning his story was being carried out at the highest levels of government, including the White House. The new cover-up involved the participation of persons serving in the current administration. If you like to study more about what Olson family have done, you can search online and you can find a lot of resources. I suggest start from archive.org. Despite all this, the tests involving unwitting and unwilling people continued. The CIA employees could meet a candidate in a bar, take them to a safe house, and administer the drug through food or drink, and then wait for the reaction. Sometimes the candidates felt ill for days afterward. The project was scrapped in 1963. A decade later, Gottlieb destroyed most of the documents regarding MKUltra, so its real scale will never be known. While MKUltra remains just a Cold War era ghost, research into new weapons and into methods of countering them has never stopped and will never stop, while countries all over the world are paying billions and billions of dollars for it. It's never ethical to experiment on a human being without the person's complete understanding of what is happening and without an agreement to be part of the experiment. We have seen the largest experimental drug distributed almost to over 75% of the population. Ethically and legally, you cannot experiment on a human being without an agreement. We put people to death in Nuremberg for doing that. So this was a short version of Project MKUltra and all the projects that came before that. And according to the government, which we are supposed to believe, it's stopped. Unfortunately, all the documents have been destroyed, and we may never find out how far these experiments went and how many people became victims of these types of research. The madness that we see after World War II, in my opinion, is the results of our compromise when we faced with German scientists and their research in many, many areas and decided to import them to the United States, keep them intact, hire them by the government or other agencies, private or public, and let them continue to do what they are doing. In future, I will talk to you about these type of so-called research, which in fact were the continuation of what was going on in Nazi Germany and how it came to the United States and brought us to the point that we are today. Okay, I hope that you find this episode interesting and helpful. Thank you for listening, and until the next time, God bless you all. Bye.
Well, it's a bill that would set up a permanent oversight committee, bipartisan committee with a rotating membership so that it would not be preempted by the agencies that it is to oversee, with sufficient authority both to keep the secrets that are legitimate and to investigate and expose wrongdoing when it occurs. We want to be sure that this country stays free, and that means that any spy agency continues to be outward looking, to spy on foreigners, but not to be spying on Americans or not to be trampling upon the laws and constitutional rights of American citizens. That would be its purpose, and in the long run it would contribute to public confidence in the CIA and make for an efficient intelligence agency operating within the law.